final part of Chapter 7, we're going to cover a little bit about anabolism and then also the crisscrossing pathways between catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions. And that's going to finish out Chapter 7. And I'm going to hit some highlights here. Your textbook has additional details. And as with everything else in this particular chapter, you want to use the study guide for Chapters 6 and 7 and get a feel for the content that's being required in my class from what I'm covering here in the video lectures. All right, so now we've talked about you have these chemoheterotroph organisms. So heterotrophs are organisms that get their carbon-containing building block molecules by absorbing those pre-made organic molecules, and they also get their energy from chemicals as well, and usually organic molecules of some type. So where do all these organic molecules come from in the first place? Now hopefully you're thinking, well, we talked about the autotrophs that make their own organic molecules. Okay, so they take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they essentially do the reverse of cellular respiration in a sense, because we've talked about how in cellular respiration organic molecules are broken apart, they're oxidized, and the carbons wind up in CO2 molecules that go floating back off to the atmosphere. Autotrophs are able to take in the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and do the reverse types of reactions that convert the carbon dioxide into organic compounds. So they're able to make their own sugars, their own fats, their own amino acids, to build their own proteins and so forth and so on. So the autotrophs of the world, chemoautotrophs and the photoautotrophs, are the original sources of these organic molecules. And we've talked a little bit about photosynthesis. So you're capturing this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, building all of these complex molecules. It requires a lot of energy and enzymes to make that happen. For photoautotrophs, the source of energy is sunlight. So they're going to take, now we're not going to cover photosynthesis in detail in this class, but the light energy is captured and that energy is used to make good old ATP, and then ATP is powering all of this synthesis that takes place. And during photosynthesis, carbohydrates are made first, and then these organisms have enzymes that will convert those carbohydrates into other kinds of organic molecules, your lipids and your proteins and so forth and so on. And photosynthesizers, when you're a little kid, you learn that plants do photosynthesis, but so do algae. There are some kinds of protozoans that have been discovered that can do photosynthesis. Lots of bacteria do it as well in various groups, like the cyanobacteria and the purple sulfur bacteria, etc., and so forth and so on. This is a picture of spirulina bacteria. Spirulina is a genus name, and they do have a spiral shape, like you're seeing here, and they're green. They're green because they have the pigments in them, the chlorophyll, that allows them to perform photosynthesis. All right, and the reason I brought up spirulina is, have you ever heard of that before? You may if you're into drinking smoothies or you go to health food stores and so forth and so on. Spirulina is sold as an energy-rich supplement that can be added to things like that. And so these are photosynthetic organisms, and they're rich in all of these organic molecules that they wind up making. But they may not tell you that it's a type of bacteria that you're adding to your smoothie or whatever it is. Okay, all life depends on photosynthesis. You may have never really thought much about this before, but if we didn't have these autotrophs down here at the bottom of the food chain, we would not be able to survive, because these autotrophs at the bottom of the food chain are food sources for things like little bunny rabbits. The bunny rabbits then get eaten by the snakes, so the snakes are absorbing their organic nutrients from the poor little bunny rabbits. And then a hawk over here is going to swoop down and gobble up the snake and absorb its organic nutrients from the snake. So your autotrophs are always at the bottom of the food chain. If you eliminate the bottom of the food chain, the organisms up higher don't have anything to survive off of. But, lots of products we use on a daily basis come from photosynthesis. Lots of foods, obviously, building materials like lumber, paper, clothing, the cotton we see growing all over the Tennessee Valley area. The fuels we put in our cars come from fossilized plant material from long ago, so it was originally produced due to photosynthesis. And that's also why when we break apart these fossilized plant molecules from long ago, they're organic compounds. And when we break them apart in our car engines, they get oxidized into carbon dioxide that goes back into the atmosphere. So that's why we hear so much today about using all these fossil fuels and releasing all of this extra carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that would not get in there naturally. All right, this is a diagram which is showing you again a little bit more about the big picture of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is very complex, so we're not going to go through it in detail. But here are the inputs over here, and here are the general outputs. So the inputs are carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, because you need some energy to power photosynthesis. Outputs are glucose and oxygen gas. The ATP is produced through a complex process that uses sunlight as the source of energy. And notice that heat is also given off as well. And then the glucose over here gets converted, as I mentioned, into amino acids, fatty acids, nucleotides, etc. And finally, let's take a look at this diagram from your textbook. And this is just trying to emphasize for you that these metabolic pathways in cells are two-way streets. You have two-way streets of catabolism and anabolism. And because of that, they're sometimes referred to as amphibolic. So you have this shifting that goes on between catabolism and anabolism, back and forth, depending on the needs of a cell. It's kind of like ambidextrous or ambidextrous if you can use both of your hands. This is amphi instead of ambi, but that prefix is essentially meaning the same thing. So we already talked about how other types of nutrients like amino acids and fatty acids and so forth can feed into catabolism. They feed into glycolysis, or they feed into the Krebs cycle of cellular respiration. And that's how you can get energy from those molecules. So all the yellow lines on here on this diagram from your textbook are catabolic lines, breaking these things down so that we get building blocks and or energy. The blue lines are anabolism. So what they're trying to show you here is, okay, so let's say a cell is always in the process of breaking down some glucose, performing glycolysis. That's a step-by-step process. So there are some intermediate molecules in here that can be siphoned off to make carbohydrates and amino acids that the cell needs for survival. Or pyruvic acid here. You got pyruvic acids that have come from glycolysis. Well, maybe you need to siphon some of those off and convert them into amino acids and or nucleotides and other carbohydrates that the cell needs. We talked about how fatty acids can be broken down to make this compound, acetyl coenzyme A, that goes into the Krebs cycle, but you can also do the reverse. So if you have these accumulated in the cell, you can also reverse and use them to build fatty acids. Fatty acids then become part of your lipids. Lipids are used to build things like cell membranes. So that's what they're trying to give you a feel for here. It's not like a cell is always doing only catabolism or only anabolism. It's a back and forth type thing that depends on what the cell's needs are. And the reality is a cell is simultaneously breaking some things down and building others. You've got a two-way street of catabolism and anabolism going on inside these particular cells. So the overall kind of big picture again, why do we care about metabolism? Because metabolism is critical for survival. It's critical for growth and reproduction. And we need many, many different kinds of enzymes in order to catalyze all of these chemical reactions that have to take place, both catabolic and anabolic. And all those chemical and physical requirements for growth that we discussed in Chapter 6, those kinds of conditions have to be met in order for an organism's enzymes to be happy, so that it can do all these chemical reactions that need to take place for energy harnessing and building all of your cell parts. And so we want to keep in mind those physical types of things that we talked about, the chemical requirements for growth, and that various organisms differ in their strategies for where they get their carbon-containing nutrients and how they obtain their energy. Okay, so that actually finishes up the video lectures for Chapter 7. Again, try not to be too scared by Chapter 6 and especially Chapter 7. I know a lot of things in microbiology sound like a foreign language when you first take microbiology, and particularly this chapter especially can sound like Greek or Spanish if you've never taken a course before where these types of topics come up. But again, try not to be too put off by the terminology. Just sit down and focus on these kind of bigger picture types of things, and hopefully it won't seem quite as intimidating as it may be when you first start off with it. And as always, post questions on the discussion board, and or you can contact me if you need some additional help.